WFOR is talking with Carla Wallace. I'm Brian Arbenz. We're at her home in the Clifton neighborhood. Carla, Louisville has been plagued lately with an upsurge in violence, crime in many parts of town. What should our response be to this problem?
Well, I think one of the things that is so difficult in this moment is that the dominant culture portrays black youth, in particular young black men, as criminals, as troublemakers, as gangbangers. And so whether we take those images in consciously or unconsciously, it makes it really difficult to look at the situation objectively and come with more compassionate responses to it. Certainly, anyone who is the victim of a mugging or an assault, that's a very frightening thing, a horrible thing to happen. When we add the framework that the perpetrators seem to be young black men, it throws us into all these stereotypes and the fears that have been fed to us in this culture about that. And so I think it also causes a knee-jerk reaction to respond with, we're going to have more police and law and order and surveillance. And yet I don't think we can shoot or lock up our way out of the situation. It could be seen as an invitation to really take seriously what are the underlying issues that may cause this kind of alienation, violence, disassociation from community, etc. And then we have the opportunity to start looking at, so what is happening in our community? And when we start looking at that, we find that JCPS has just been named among the top 10 most racially biased school systems in the country when it comes to disciplining of youth of color. Now, if a youth of color sees a little white Jamie doing something and he gets maybe a talking to or maybe gets sent to the principal, but then his friend Javon does something, and Javon is a young black student, and Javon gets suspended, I can't imagine what that does to the psychology of someone who sees that unfairness happening right before their eyes. You know, a lot of times we talk about racism and bigotry as being about people's attitudes, and certainly that's part of it. But if we start delving into systems and institutions that have tremendous effect on people's lives in this community, whether it's the court system, the police, the education system, housing, environmental issues, then we start seeing that there is a disproportionate impact across the board on people of color. That has to impact how our young people feel about what's fair and unfair in this community.
Let's start with the courts. In criminal justice, we have the largest percentage of people in prison of any nation in the world, and that includes such places as North Korea and Iran.
Absolutely.
And estimates are at least half, maybe more than half of them, are nonviolent criminals who in almost every other democracy would be dealt with in ways other than imprisonment, and yet the results of locking all these people up are we have higher crime rates in almost every violent crime than all these other countries that deal with it differently. How can we start to affect change in that issue right here?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Brian, and it's a place in our society that a lot of people can avoid looking at. For those of us who don't get in trouble with the law, who's in our prison systems or who's going before the judge every day is something we just don't see. And so it's a place where I feel like the ways that the overall system is not working, or at least not working for most people, shows up in the most serious ways, let's say. So for instance, we could look at the issues of juries. It has been investigated, it has been in the media, the fact that it is very difficult for somebody to get a jury of their peers if we're talking about disproportionate numbers of people of color coming before the courts in the first place, and then not having a jury that looks like them, or at least part of the jury looks like them, and then people argue, oh yeah, well, we invite those people and they just don't show up. That doesn't take into account, okay, so who doesn't have child care so that they can show up for the jury? Who is trying to work 3 jobs instead of 2 jobs so they can't afford to take that off to be on the jury? We don't look at all the contributing factors that might cause a jury to not be racially representative. And yet if it's not, how can we argue that somebody is getting a fair trial? So that's just one piece. But we could back up from there and say, well, if the studies show that white people use drugs to about the same degree as black and brown people, why is it that who's getting arrested are brown people and black people? In just a terrific, terrific view of this by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow. Just one piece of what she talks about, for instance, in the so-called war on drugs. I think most of us know about the disproportionality around if you get caught with cocaine or you get caught with crack, you know, the many times more higher the charges for one than the other. Now they've narrowed it that some, but I think it's still 18 times, you know, for crack cocaine. But another piece that we might not think of as much is that when the police are deciding where are they going to go after the drugs, it is much more politically expensive, and they will get much more pushback if they're going into rolling fields, for instance, than if they're going into a less politically powerful community in the Shawnee neighborhood, let's say, or in Parkland or something. So the police are making judgments about where they send their people in. Now that's not something we would necessarily think about, but you know, I really encourage people to read Michelle Alexander's book.
That's the quota.
So much.
That's the quota system, the racial preference quota system we don't hear about. One of the many. Exactly.
Exactly. The fact, I mean, people are appalled when they hear that police departments get resources according to how many arrests, especially around drugs, to the point that some of them were even being offered around the country helicopters and the kind of firepower that you would only see in the case of one of our illegal wars, you know, but pointing that, now they're not going to take that artillery, you know, into the East End. They're just not going to do it, even if the studies show that people are pretty much using drugs at equal levels around the community. So, you know, we could look at, when we're looking into the criminal justice system, and I think it's a critical place for us to look, we could look at racial profiling by police. Who's more likely to get pulled over in the first place? While we don't have as notorious a stop and frisk policy going on as New York has seen, when we look at the statistics, young black youth are more likely to be stopped on our streets than white youth, even if there's no sign of a crime, just stopped and questioned. But what that does psychologically to somebody, to feel like every time I go out, or so many times I go out, I get stopped by the police, goodness forbid I run. You know, every black mother or every mother of a child of color in this community has to have the talk, especially if she has a son of color, about don't run when you see police, don't talk back when you see police, cooperate when you see the police. The police are not necessarily your friend, whereas in a similar white family, that's not the conversation. Now the policeman is your friend. Go to him if you are lost. Go to him if you are unsure, or her if you are unsure. And that all creates a psychology in this community where people of color have less reason, and it's reality-based, to trust the systems that some of us take for granted or put there for some kind of, goodwill. But we could follow all the way through at the arrest point, at the sentencing point, at the in the courtroom, the fairness in the courtroom. How long and how often people are put in jail. When are they at the bail point, at the parole point. At every point in the criminal justice system, we see people of color being treated differently than white people. Now, to me, the potential, though, for joining together is that the other folks who are in prison are poor white folks. Mm-hmm. And even though, as white people, we see, it's mostly, and the whole, it's like criminal people think black person, there are poor white people in there too.
If you've ever toured a prison, you see the first thing that people tend to say, and I was told this by the prison chaplain when I toured LaGrange, Kentucky State Reformatory. He said the first thing people say is, gee, I thought everybody here would be black.
Yes.
The large majority are white.
Exactly.
Still disproportionately it's minority,
Exactly.
but we do have those preconceptions from television shows and other stereotypes. What about media? Local media as well as national media. Mm-hmm. It seems like they have never been able to get away from one form of stereotyping or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because so many people get their perception of the world through the media, plays a tremendous role in how we see things. So just your point about there aren't a lot of rich white people in prison. We know that because they're running the country. But there are a lot of poor white people. But as long as the perception is crime equals black, it keeps us from building the kind of cross-race coalition that could challenge the prison system as a whole. And I see that happening, being reinforced by the media. It's like, rather than the media being able to uncover the truth, they're often covering the truth by parroting the stereotypes and the certain way of seeing things that we know are problematic. Now, I also have to say, there is media that works really hard to bring what I call it's so, when media talks about being objective, I'm sorry, but, objectivity is really quite an abused word. And I think it's a way of covering up the tremendous slant when they say, oh, well, we're just being objective. It's like, well, why did you only talk to these authorities and you didn't talk to the community people that were impacted? Well, we're trying to be objective. It's like, well, we're already dealing with an unobjective situation. There are power differentials, etc. But I am, really glad that there are those struggling media forms, investigative reporters who do serious work. Forsooth, of course, is one of them. I have been very pleased with some of the pieces I've seen in Leo, going deeper into issues. They did a really good piece recently on the youth violence downtown, in which they tried to talk about long-term solutions, What an amazing thing, which is exactly what we do need to be talking about is long-range solutions. So I think it's very important for the public that's concerned to challenge the media, to write letters to the editor. I come from a journalist family. My father was a journalist, and he used to joke to me, he said, now, Carla, he said, one of the most read pages in the paper is letters to the editor,
yes.
So make sure you write them. Now, I don't know if that is as true now in the age of social media, but I think people still do notice, what are people writing and thinking about the things that are happening.
Henry Wallace made great use of the letters to the editor section. I think the most memorable things I've ever read in Courier Journal and Louisville Times clips in the past are his letters, definitely.
Yeah. I wish I have had the knack to write them as short and pithy.
Oh yes, oh yes. That's why they're unforgettable.
Yes.
They stay with you.
Exactly. It was
Yeah.
almost a bumper sticker.
Yes. Right.
So,
What we heard restorative justice being brought up in a press conference and talking about what needs to be done. What does restorative justice mean, and how can it be implemented in our community?
Well, I'm glad you're asking about that, because I think related to the recent youth violence on the waterfront, the situation in our schools around discipline is absolutely a contributory factor to the way youth of color feel about their investment in this community. Again, I mentioned, the disproportionate suspension rates, and that JCPS is under a federal investigation now. But JCPS also had their own racial equity study done, which showed similar results. That youth of color, children of color, we're not just talking teenagers, children of color are more likely to be suspended. And just one suspension increases by many times the likelihood that a young person will drop out. And therefore, the current disciplinary practices in JCPS are what people say contributes to the school to prison pipeline. Where restorative justice can come in is that instead of moving to suspension as the only way for a teacher to feel she or he can keep control of the classroom, they actually look at a student making amends for, or restoring to wholeness, as where the word comes from, the person or persons or property that has been damaged or what has happened. So, for instance, if a child has hurt another child, to be able to say, I'm sorry, and I won't do it again, and then to not do it again. Maybe it also means that they will come a little early and help set up the classroom. Those other ways of teaching responsibility and supporting teachers to have alternatives. Now, the school system initially, under the current superintendent, Dr. Hargis, had been receptive to the idea of restorative justice and had agreed to implement restorative justice in at least 3 schools as a trying out basis. They had made this agreement to a faith-based organization called Clout, which has a large membership in this community. And then what happened is other schools said, well, we'd like to try that too. Let us try the restorative justice. Not only have they not responded in a positive way to allow other schools to try out restorative justice, but what they've done with the 3 schools that they say they were going to implement it in has hardly made any progress at all. And so this is one of the reasons there's the federal investigation, because JCPS has not shown that they're willing to address what are very stark and hard figures, actual research and data that they have done themselves and that is showing the problem. And
so in the 3 schools, what was the problem? Did the JCPS just not implement it in those 3 schools where it was supposed to be?
Well, I think that part of what they're saying is, well, we're still looking at that and we have to make some changes in the disciplinary code, all of which is true. The problem is that this was a couple of years ago, and there has to be a will to make the changes. And I think one thing that's very important is the community pushing for this is not blaming or accusing the teachers. Because what we find is that each school, when it's under this whole No Child Left Behind and teaching to the test framework, it means the principal is getting pressure to deliver certain scores. That principal is going to turn around and put that pressure on the teachers. So the space for them to actually do things different. So they're saying, well, I'm trying to teach to the test, but there are a couple of disruptive students and I need them out of my classroom, you know. So there's a whole conundrum here. But if we're going to change it, there has to be the political will from the top. There has to be a decision. This is a crisis. If some people's children are being treated in such a different manner that they're ending up getting on the school to prison pipeline and in prison, to me that's a crisis. And it's a civil rights crisis, because while there are white and black and brown children facing suspension, the disproportionality is so out of whack that it is a civil rights issue in our community, and that should be of urgent concern. And you know, I see some of the response to what happened on the waterfront, including issues of youth programming and a lot of groups, Actors Theater, Shawnee neighborhood groups, some of the local entertainers and that cultural community are stepping up and saying, we'll keep our doors longer, we're going to do open longer, we're going to do other programming. And that is all good, but it still doesn't get to the institutional issues. If the school is still spitting these young people out onto the street and they're deciding they're not going to go back to school, they're not going to end up in a situation where they can get a job, you know, that's decent, and they're going to end up turning to other things that, you know, are going to get them in a lot of trouble. And then they end up in a criminal justice system which is skewed based on class and race, and there you have it, you know, folks going down, and that's their life path then.
Jobs. We saw tremendous discrimination decades ago, outright discrimination by banks. We saw the deindustrialization of black communities. We also saw the Community Reinvestment Act start to turn things around. We saw a lot of African-American business people opening up businesses in West Louisville, many parts of West Louisville. We saw a lot of progress. Then we see the housing crisis and a severe recession. What direction do we need to go to provide an economy in communities like West Louisville and other parts of Louisville that are suffering, that can provide adequate jobs at wages to support community stability and family stability?
Yeah, critical, and that gets at one of the systemic problems. Imagine if, in relationship to the recent developments, we had leadership that said, wow, we are going to look at investment dollars as a whole in Jefferson County. We're going to look at where they are going, and we are going to provide incentives for development in the areas that have been the most neglected. And we're going to do that and looking for partners that are going to provide living wage jobs. Instead, we see a huge patch of land down on, what is it at 18th and Broadway?
Yeah.
Where there used to be a huge factory that provided union wages. People could support their families. It was one of the places in town where black families were able to get good jobs. And instead, we see that replaced with a Walmart, which, while some people say, well, better some jobs than no jobs, is one of the most notorious employers for paying such a low wage that their employees have to get public assistance, have to go on welfare and food stamps in order to make ends meet. So that's one issue, is to look at where's the investment and who are we handing those investment dollars to. If we're handing out money, and we are giving Walmart development money, we should have a binding contract that says, and in exchange, you will provide this many local jobs, and you will provide, you know, these decent wages. So that's one place. Another place is we have prohibitive, we have policies in place where multifamily homes can't be built, you know, that you can move to single family homes, but you can't have multifamily units. That means people of lower income have a hard time finding places to rent. We have housing developers getting incentives from our city and then being able to put up developments that include no affordable housing. What if there was a percentage allowance that if somebody's getting development dollars, they have to provide a certain percentage of affordable housing as part of their development? That means that families could afford housing closer to where the jobs are. That's a huge issue. Child care and transportation get the jobs. And then thirdly, and this one, would be amazing, is there are some municipalities around the country who have decided that they're not waiting for the federal government. They are going to raise the minimum wage within their municipality. We are allowed to do that. If families are taking home more money, even in these fast food places, that is a higher minimum wage than what we are having now, that means more money in the pockets to afford rents, to afford transportation, to afford child care, to afford health care. Those are three things we could do. We could look at where are investment dollars going. We could look at a provision that says a certain percentage of every housing development has to include affordable housing. And we could look at raising the minimum wage. Those would be things that would be profound change makers in the lives of people who are the most marginalized in our community.
It sounds like we've got a real solid agenda here. Out of this simple discussion, there are some real concrete ideas out there. We don't just have to just lament the reality and wish for things. There are some real things we could be doing. Yeah. Is there enough of that? Is there enough unity out there among all the amalgam of groups on the left, black, white, brown, everything else? It strikes me that there is maybe a lot of unity of spirit, but everybody has a different political approach. Some say, well, neighborhood empowerment is the solution instead of integration. Some say faith-based. Some say no, a radical socialist approach. We're hearing people say, why are so many immigrants building the food marts or opening the food marts in the West End instead of local people? We're hearing, it just seems like everything breaks up into a lot of sectarian disagreement.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's it's an important strategic question, and I think that you're right that a lot of times our efforts get siloed, separated from one another. And so one of the things that I think for those of us who are involved in progressive organizations need to encourage, support, educate around a more intersectional approach to the problems we face. And by that I don't mean everybody works on everything. But for instance, for environmental organizations in town that are working, for instance, on the pipeline or on mountaintop removal or whatever, to look at that issue and say, what are the class and race connections of that issue? So, for instance, when it comes to the environmental issues, why is it that the biggest polluters feel that they can have a nice, safe, comfy home out in the West End and the poorer communities, and they wouldn't dare set up, here in Crescent Hill or in the Highlands? Well, the environmental organizations, if they're not dealing with the issue of race, cannot make a reality-based case for why these industries choose less empowered communities to place themselves. If we're talking about that, we can. There's a way to build a coalition by if those companies are polluting in the West End, and we know that Louisville has been named one of the top most polluted, communities in the country. Partly we're in this valley. But it's also because the pollutants from West Louisville, and Southwest Louisville, are coming across the whole community. So for people in the East End who think, oh, well, that's not my issue, that these companies are in West Louisville, it is our issue. If you have a child with asthma and you're living in the Highlands, that child is going to be impacted by the particulates that are coming over here from West Louisville. I think we have to look at more potential for coalitions across racial lines. You know, I hear people all the time say, yeah, but we got to get rid of capitalism. I want to get rid of capitalism too. I believe that capitalism is a system which uses people up and spits them out. It benefits a small minority at the expense of the few. Capitalism used to argue, oh, but we're creating this huge middle class. The United States has a growing separation between the have and have-nots that is bigger than almost any time in the past 4 or 5 decades. It is only increasing, and so much. And the middle class, as you mentioned, the housing crisis, has been undermined by loss of jobs, loss of good jobs, loss of union jobs, and loss of homes, etc., etc. The potential is there for people to join together. But over and over again, race and racism is the go-to strategy to maintain an unfair economic system. So I say, if we're trying to change an unfair economic system, and the glue that holds it together is racism, is the way that they keep just enough disproportionality so that white folks say, oh yeah, but at least I'm not as bad off as those people. Mm-hmm. It means that those of us who also could benefit from a change in the economic system are buying into the idea of, yeah, but maybe we could one day be that rich, the rich white folks that are ruling things. Yeah. And that is an illusion. Yeah. It is a myth, but it's a very powerful myth for white people. And as long as, it's almost like racism becomes the canary in the mind. Before the foreclosure crisis hit, people of color were having a hard time either getting loans to buy houses, or they were getting very skewed loans so they wouldn't be able to keep their homes. Those foreclosures on people of color were happening a long time before the big foreclosure crisis hit. But for a lot of white people, oh, well, that's those people.
Or it's a cultural tendency. It's
or
because
whatever,
of,
blame them, etc. Then suddenly the bank was knocking at their door. And they're like, and you heard people saying this, but I worked hard all my life. True. And I'm not one of those people that sponges off the system. Okay, a lot of white people who have been hurt in this recent economic system have not spoken up when people of color were losing jobs or getting the worst jobs or losing homes or being arrested more often and unfairly by the police. If we start realizing that while white people, we may get certain privilege, we're arrested less, we're more likely to get the loan, we're not the soonest to be fired, etc., etc. But overall, we're still suffering too. As long as the system can pay people of color, for instance, immigrant people, less than their work is worth, do we think somehow they're going to say, and let's pay the white people a whole bunch more than they're worth? No, they're able to keep a lot of union wages down too by crushing the unions. And then, it's like that quote, it's the Pastor Niemöller quote, first they came for the communists.
I was just thinking
and I didn't
about
speak
that.
up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists. I didn't speak up. Then they came for the Catholic. And it goes on until he says, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up. I believe that's one of the ways that this system works, is we think, oh, well, that's happening to those people. And it's often across the color line. Instead of saying, what happens if all of us who are being screwed over to one extent or another find common cause? And I think that's an important strategy in the progressive movement here in Louisville too, is to not say as much, well, who's getting credit for this, or who's getting credit, or, well, that's not my issue, but look for those moments. And I think we just saw one in the Ban the Box effort here. We won ban the box, which means at least in the initial interview, potential city employees do not have to say, yes, I'm a felon, and be right away knocked out of the application process. They at least get to make the case for themselves as an employee.
Exactly.
And that is very important when we talk about people coming out of prison and not being able to get jobs, not being able to get public housing, not being able to vote. And what we saw was a bipartisan support because the community was able to come together enough to say we all want this, to convince Metro Hall to pass it and the mayor to support it. And to their credit, they did so. But we need more of those moments. That a group can be working on its issue, because all the issues that groups are working on are very important. But if we work on those issues with an intersectional approach, for instance in the peace community, to be talking about how does war use racism to garner support for itself, you know? Talking about those people that we're bombing, you know, dehumanizing people that we're killing, undermining programming here that disproportionately impacts people of color. Who ends up feeling they have to go into the military to fight?
The poverty draft.
Yes,
exactly.
and as we start talking more about how race and class connect to issues of peace and war, we suddenly start broadening who can be the potential coalition against war. I mean, in his brilliant last years, Martin Luther King was making the connection between civil rights, war, and workers' rights. That is a powerful triad. And it's a triad that scares the you-know-what out of people who want to keep things the same. And to me, that needs to be what we look for in all our work, no matter what issue we're working on. If we can bring that intersection of saying, what are the economics here, what are the racial issues here, and how does it connect with issues of war and peace, I think that would be extremely powerful. It's been interesting to me, we've been able to move, and the environmental movement, to its credit, has been moving more to take into account racial justice issues, using the term environmental justice, and looking at who is disproportionately impacted by toxins and where they put the poisoning industries, et cetera, et cetera. But very slow, the environmental movement on looking at what war has to do with the environment. War is one of the most devastating impacts on the planet when it comes to destroying the ecosystems. And we need to be talking about that more. But people say, well, you know, we can't talk about war because, and then it's like, well, then you're missing out a whole bunch of people who have worked all their life for peace and against war, who could potentially be allies in the struggle around the environment. So I think we just have to start connecting up the dots more, and then looking for the moments where it makes sense to all converge, whether it's on City Hall or Frankfurt or the White House, where we say, yes, I'm working on this issue, and in this moment we could make an advance on this issue, and let's join together to do that. I think we'd be a lot stronger.
I like that. I think we have been able to touch on some points that give a lot of direction and call for a lot more discussion in this community.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carla. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
It's been a real pleasure
talking.
talking
Let me put in
to
a
you.
plug for folks who want to, you know, because I think there's a lot of people out there who want to connect the issues and want to be more effective. And one of the things I'm involved in is Louisville Showing Up for Racial Justice. And that came about in response to, rather than a post-racial society with the election of President Obama, first black president, we saw a huge racial backlash. And people of color were saying, where are the white people confronting this? Yeah. And we started looking at, how do those of us who are white support each other more, rather than just waiting to call each other out? How can we support each other to be stronger racial justice allies in this work, and to bring a racial justice perspective to whatever piece of work we're doing there? So if people are interested in learning more about that, I would encourage them to check out El Surge on Facebook or through forsooth or whatever. So thank you so
Good
much,
thing,
George.
Thank you, Carla. Thank you
You're
so
the
much.
best.
Well,
Thank
that's very
you for
kind
your
of
work.
you. Well, that's very
And
kind
you know,
of you.
I grew up in FOR, so
Oh,
I
great,
appreciate all
great.
the hard work
Well,
the organization does.
your work has been just inspiring to everybody.
Oh,
You
thank
don't tire, and
Yes.
we all wish we could be that way.
Well, I find that it is mutual. So
Well, thank you. Okay.